All right, well, an official welcome. So, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar hosted by the Mallee Catchment Management Authority. My name's James Callum. I'm the General Manager of Operations with the Mallee CMA, and I've got the pleasure of introducing today's speakers and helping to get as many of your submitted questions responded to in the time that we have available to us. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Murray River floodplains and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We recognise their enduring and ongoing relationship and the importance of their care for culture on this country. I myself today am on the land of the Taunurong, and I pay my respects to their elders' nations, past, present and emerging. Okay, the webinar's come about today because of a lot of questions that community have raised with us as we've been out and about talking about the Victorian Murray Floodplain Restoration Project. And the questions that we get from community are often quite complex, and they take many government organisations to answer them. So they're not sort of in the wheelhouse of one agency. And so we've got this unique opportunity, I suppose, during COVID, where we can't meet up face to face, to get all the agencies together and answer some of those questions that are on the minds of community. So that's what today's forum is about. It's about answering those questions, which otherwise we haven't been able to answer fully in the past. Today, you've got the pleasure of hearing from our colleagues who've got responsibility and accountability for decisions about Victoria's Basin Plan implementation, about the management of the Murray floodplains and environmental watering. We've got presenters from Parks Victoria, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and to round out the day, we've got 3 presenters from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. So there's the journey that we're going to go on. Because it's an online forum, we'll be relying on that Q&A function where we'll ask you to type in questions and comment as we go through the day. You're right to keep it on that one. So apparently the chat function may be available. If it is, please avoid that and look for the Q&A function as we move through, just as a message. We're going to kick off today hearing about what's so special about Victoria's Murray floodplains and some of the reasons that they need us to take action. We'll also hear about what's being done to protect and restore flooding regimes and high-value habitat, and why we're confident that we'll improve ecological outcomes in these areas. And finally, we'll hear about how Victoria is implementing the Basin Plan and opportunities for you to hear updates on the work that's currently being undertaken, including feeding into the environmental effects statement process. So that's the agenda for today. And if we move on to the next slide, Kate. This is just a bit of housekeeping. So as I said, Q&A, I can't stress that one enough. Forget the chat, go for the Q&A. We're expecting today to take around an hour and a half, of which the first hour will be focusing on our presenters and working through that journey I just described. And then we'll have some time for your questions. And as they come to mind throughout the presentations today, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. And if we can answer them at the time, we'll push those back through. If you've got points of clarification where, if we get a bit acronym heavy, feel free to pop that in there. What does that mean? And we'll make sure I'll quiz our presenters as we go so that they can clarify that. All right, so we'll kick off. No further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dan McLaughlin, who's the Regional Director with Parks Victoria, to take us through the values of the Murray floodplain. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, James, and thanks for the intro. Hopefully you can hear me all right. And yeah, I'm here today to talk about the values of the floodplain from a land manager's perspective. And before I start though, I'd like to acknowledge where I am today. I'm in Castlemaine on Dja Dja Wurrung country, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging for the Dja Dja Wurrung people, but also the many First Nations that live along the Murray, from right over in the east up into the northwest. And I'll talk a bit about those values. I'll talk a bit about why people love the Murray before I hand over to others to talk specifically about the importance of water and how we work on that. So if you move into the next slide, thanks, Kate. Just as a bit continuing with that intro. So for me, who am I? Some might be saying I might know some on the call, but I'm Regional Director with Parks Victoria for Northern Victoria, which takes in most of the Murray from Lake Hume all the way through to the South Australia border and all the parks and national parks, kind of north of the Divide, the desert parks and the ones around Bendigo, across to the foothills of King Lake and near Wangaratta and Beechworth. So a big slab of Victoria, water and the floodplain, a big part of my role and a big part of the land that we manage. So firstly, yeah, connecting the country, just touching on that and, the importance that that many of us put in value of the Murray has been there for thousands of years to First Nations communities, and due to that availability of resources, regular flooding, the ability to utilise those resources, First Nations people have lived along the Murray for generations, and it's thought that because of that reliability, it was one of the most populated parts of Australia before European settlement or colonisation. There's a lot of tangible evidence there now, scar trees, mounds, artefacts, scatters, ancestral remains that demonstrate that ongoing connection for thousands of generations. Part of our role is protecting that. There's also the intangible aspects of it and the song lines that exist along the Murray as well. So, one of the key things of why we value it is because of this tangible demonstration of First Peoples of Australia and First Peoples of Victoria that have that connection. On the next slide, thanks, Kate. So, moving on from that, from the initial first values is what is a floodplain? And if we look at the Murray River as that iconic river of southeastern Australia, that's such a feature in how we define ourselves, particularly the border of Victoria at the moment and the ability to cross the border into New South Wales. It's been limited. It's many know the Murray River, but the floodplain itself is not just the river. It's the floodplain when the water comes out and goes into those runners and fills up those billabongs, and water is integral to this part of the landscape. And like fire for other parts of the state, water is the disturbance factor here for river red gum forests, and without it, we know that the ecosystem as it is at the moment will decline. And there's some pictures there on the screen that show the response to environmental watering or natural flooding that demonstrate that reliance that has that. Some of the species are water dependent, like the red gum, turtles and frogs. Others are dependent on that ecosystem and move in and out. Some of the migratory birds, particularly, that come down from China and Japan, and the rookeries that are created without the water, without that habitat, there is no place for them to come to in that time of refuge. Moving on a little bit to talk a bit about that biodiversity and the unique biodiversity that exists on the floodplain, and really demonstrates the value of this part of Victoria. It's such a refuge in an agricultural landscape, in a climate challenge landscape. The river is the last bit of refuge for some of these species, and moving from the Mallee country into the grasslands, into the Alps, the Murray is that transition for many of these species, and provides the refuge in times of droughts. And others, as there's the ones we know, the birds and small mammals, and then there's the in-stream invertebrates and others as well that are just as important. So water quality is just as important to the floodplain health as well. Unique and threatened species as well, which I touched on a little bit. Just some pictures, just sharing some of the imagery of the things that we see, the things that we value there. The superb parrot, regent parrot. Some of those unique bits of vegetation that without water won't persist. The landscape will change. There'll be other species come in. And carpet python, which is an iconic species along there, at its southernmost extent in many of its elements, and moves into the rocky granite outcrops around where the Ovens meets the Murray, the Warby Ranges. So, in a floristic and fauna value, it's quite unique. But yeah, people love the Murray as well. It's not just its environmental values. It's what it brings for recreation and socialising, for camping, fishing, canoeing, bird watching. Some of the visitation stats you can see on the screen there of 10 to 15,000 people to the remote areas of Lindsay Island, and 70,000 visitors a year to Hattah Kulkyne. I expect the weekend ahead, with restrictions being lifted in Melbourne, we'll see caravans and boats and many people coming out of the suburbs to get back to the Murray and enjoy it for that that resilience that it also builds in people. People have a connection with nature. People have wanted to connect to nature even more so through COVID and appreciating their local environment. And we're seeing that increase right across the state in usage of public land. And we're keen to invest in uplifting those recreational experiences as well where we can in providing linkages for canoe trails and other things along. But we need water to provide those linkages as well, and need to integrate the management of water in providing that experience. So moving lastly to my summary, because I don't want to take up all the time, and we've got other speakers to come, is, like I said, from a land manager's perspective, they're hugely important for ecological and recreational use, and a cornerstone of nature-based tourism for local economies. We work in partnership with local government and other agencies about the product, the visitor experience, and making it available for people to come and spend time in the towns along the river. People have a long connection to the floodplain, thousands of years. Evidence of that occupation is there, and we do everything we can to protect that, and work with traditional owners on managing the country together. Like I said, floodplain health relies on water. These systems evolve with water. They've been through the changes of regulation in the system. The space we're in now, which you'll hear other speakers talk about today, is how do we make sure we get that right and protect those values for everyone to enjoy. And the connection of our management of a system that's a managed system and a modified system is the challenge we've all got ahead of us in protecting and appreciating the floodplain for what it is. So thanks, James.
Thank you very
I'm
much,
not sure
Dan.
if we're going to take questions now or we're going to take them later.
We'll take them at the end. We'll give people the chance to pop them in the Q&A as we move through. But that was a great start, Dan. Thanks. Some wonderful imagery, and I think it's a good way to remind us all of what's at stake with these projects. So thank you very much for that. Now very pleased to hand over to Nick Sheehan from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. He's the Director of the Sustainable Diversion Limit Adjustment Mechanism Implementation. And Nick's going to take us on a bit of a journey into the past and talk about what's happened to these sensitive and really special landscapes, probably since European occupation, Nick. So over to you.
Thank you. Can we skip to the next slide without my haircut on it? So thanks everyone for giving us a little bit of your time today. My role today is to talk to you a little bit about the modifications to the flows in the River Murray and how they've come about over the past couple of hundred years. So the floodplains and the flows that come onto and leave those floodplains have changed significantly over the past couple of hundred years since European occupation. There's been significant catchment clearing and irrigation removal of habitats, and those have brought with them their own changes in flows and salinity. We've constructed dams and water diversions, again changing the flows. We've as a society, we've been using those forests through forestry for fuel, for construction, and as I said earlier, just clearing in some instances. We've constructed drainage works to allow us to use what were historically very wet areas of the landscape for agricultural or urban purposes or industrial purposes. And we've introduced a huge number of pest plants and animals that again alter the habitat of the floodplain. And alongside that, we've been carving out little bits of the floodplain that we really don't want water to get into. So we've been constructing flood mitigation works all the way as well. So there's a huge amount of change going on. I'll skip to the next slide, please. So I've grabbed this slide from the MDBA's website. I'm not going to talk about the detail of what's in all of the little bubbles there, but I will say this: the top of the chart is talking about the floods and droughts over the last couple of hundred years in the Murray-Darling Basin. So you can see that floods and droughts are a regular feature of how this basin works. But just have a look at the scale of the flood peaks from 1956 onwards. So just have a look at that and have a think about what that means for floodplain communities and river flows in general. Underneath the sort of timeline there, you've got the grey bubbles there that are talking about when are the major bits of infrastructure constructed in the Murray-Darling Basin. You can see this enormous burst of effort from the late 1800s through to the 1970s, where the community invests a massive effort in building storages and regulating the river, at first for navigation purposes, and then really to wring every drop that we can out of it as a water resource to support our communities and our agricultural enterprises. And then lastly, on this slide, we've got the green area, which is talking about when are there major policy changes in the management of water agreements between states and all of that sort of stuff in the basin. And you can see early on they set up the rules for sharing the water in the basin, all of the agreements and things. Typically after or during most of the droughts, there's a little bit of a tweak to those policy settings. But as we get to the 1980s and 1990s, we see an enormous number of policy amendments. And what that's telling us is that the policies need to be changed, because nobody changes a policy for fun. It's just not that much fun. There need to be policy changes, and that's because we're starting to stretch the resource right to its limits, and community expectations around the management of that resource are starting to change. So over that period, we're hitting the limits in terms of what we can get out of the resource, and the community is becoming more and more aware of the impact of managing that water and the expectation to preserve natural environments. So I'll skip to the next slide. So if we put that in a schematic or a sort of graphical spatial representation of what that looks like in the basin plan, what's the result of the last 100 years? Huge amounts of infrastructure. You can see all the little triangles down the bottom end of the Murray. They're the locks and weirs in the system that were built to help the paddle steamers and later served a role in providing stable weir pools for irrigation supplies and all of that sort of thing. You can see the large circles there. They're the major storages within the system. You can see the channels and the irrigation districts in the orangey yellow color there. So a huge amount of intervention in the basin. And the further you go down the river, the more profound the cumulative impact of that goes. And that's the story of why you see all of those policy interventions towards the end of that timeline is where we're really wringing this thing out. We're making it work hard. Next slide. So early in the basin plan, there was in the sort of presentation. Sorry.
No, it could be my daughter. I've just yeah. Do you want me to do a Q&A to see how I am?
Okay. It's obviously, yep, that's resolved now. You're fine.
I'll scoot on. So this is a table from a modelling report that was prepared very early on in the sort of presentation and delivery of the basin plan. So around about 2011 and 12, somewhere around there. This report's showing how well the basin plan will meet its environmental objectives under a couple of scenarios, and they're with 2,800 gigalitres of water with and without relaxed constraints, and with 3,200 gigalitres of water coming back to the environment with and without relaxed constraints. And what this table tells us is that the basin plan was going to struggle to meet high floodplain or sort of outer floodplain environmental targets, no matter how much water was recovered, within reason, of course, and no matter how relaxed constraints were within reason. So this is really a part of the story of why the states came back to the table after that initial presentation of the basin plan, said, hang on, there's more work to be done here, and that story is a little bit about is what others will tell you after this presentation. So we'll skip to the next one. Another way of looking at the difference between basin plan and natural is this hydrograph. It's my favourite. Some people like it, some people don't, but I love it. So what we've got on the chart here is River Murray flows under a few different scenarios, and it's River Murray flows just upstream of the South Australian border. The time period we've chosen is the 1990s and the millennium drought. So the 1990s are a pretty wet period, and of course the millennium drought was disastrously dry. What this chart does tell us is that there are differences between the three scenarios presented. The blue is what would have happened if there'd been no dams, no diversions, no intervention. The red is what would have happened under pre-basin plan settings, and the green is what would have happened under post-basin plan settings. So this chart tells us that even with basin plan, we're missing the top third of our flood peaks in this reach of the river also, even in the wet times, and we're missing weeks and months or months in some instances of duration on those flood peaks. So what that tells me is that our floodplain ecosystems, the ones that Dan did such a nice job of telling us how valuable they are as ecosystems in their own right and to the community, they're not seeing the water that they're evolved to live with and depend on. So that's putting enormous stress on ecosystems. And again, others will talk more about that in subsequent presentations. But the key point I want you to take out of this is that even with the basin plan in wet times, the environment is missing out, and in the dry times on the right-hand side of the chart, the impact on the environment is even more profound because the storages are very, very effective during dry times as they have that much more room to take what rain there is. There are no spills during a drought. I think that's all from me, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nick. That was a really good presentation across some pretty heavy going material, and I took three key messages out. So let me check those back with you as I presented. One is just the profound impact of river regulation on floodplains, and that water recovery on its own through basin plan is not enough to quench the thirst of the floodplains in the lower reaches of the river, because the impact is so, you said the cumulative impact further down was so much greater. And the third is, I suppose, that we're going to be in need of this massive sort of national first project to then deal with that gap. But no doubt we'll hear more about that next. Have I captured your messaging there, Nick?
Thankfully, yes.
That's good. It did work. It did work. So look, now we're going to hear from Victorians about from the Victorian government about how they're implementing Basin Plan as a world-class restoration program using, I think, better management of water recovered for environmental outcomes, complementary works and measures, as well as environmental works and constraints management to deal with the doom and gloom scenario that Nick presents us with, which is something that's been happening to our system for well over 100 years now, Nick. So very pleased to invite Shah now to present. And just a reminder to all of our attendees watching along here today, the Q&A function is available for you now. So should you have any questions along the way, feel free to pop them in and we'll make sure we get our presenters on the hook and answering those questions. Thanks, Shah.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. So I'm Shah Ramamurthy. I'm the Senior Manager of the Environmental Water Policy Team in DELWP. I've been working in the environmental water space for something maybe 15 or 16 years now. First in Mildura for a few years and then later at DELWP. So I've been working mostly on Murray-related projects, so Living Murray, these Basin Plan environmental works projects, which was what we called them before they became the BMFRP, and now looking at environmental water policy more broadly across the state. Today I'm just going to tell you a bit about the impacts of climate change on our red gum floodplains. So adding to the problems from river regulation and the other things that people have done over the past 200 years to our floodplains that Nick just described, our rivers and floodplains are also now faced with climate change. So we know this is going to stress these systems even further, and they're already struggling. So there's clear evidence that this is happening now. So if you have a look at this graph, it shows inflows from Victorian tributaries in the Southern Basin over the past 120 years. The area inside the red box highlights the last 20. So you can clearly see that aside from the floods in 2010-11, which was the end of the millennium drought, and in 2016, Flows during this 20-year period have been much lower than that long-term average. You can see there are many more years that fall within the driest 10% of years, which are shown by red bars, compared to the past 100 years. And there's a similar story for inflows across the Murray-Darling Basin. Next slide, please. So this one shows the problems looking forward. So the maps at the top show CSIRO's projected changes in runoff by 2065 under a high emissions scenario. So the red colours represent a reduction in runoff, blue shows an increase, and the darker the colour, the bigger the change. So the takeaway from these maps at the top is that there are large reductions in runoff under most scenarios. So we can really be expecting the trend of the last 20 years of fewer wet years and more dry years to continue. What this means is fewer floods across the board with longer gaps between these and less variability. So less of those medium-sized floods that maintain a functioning floodplain. And we know from the modelling done by the MDBA that Nick showed you earlier that the additional environmental water that's coming into the system through the basin plan, even if we recovered 3,200 gigalitres of water and fully relaxed constraints, there are areas of that higher floodplain that just don't get watered, particularly as you get further downstream. And there are still going to be those really long dry periods, which are far too long for those floodplain systems to survive. And to top it all off, while there's some uncertainty about how severe things will get and how quickly it will go with rainfall and runoff, there's a lot more certainty about what's happening to temperature. So at the bottom, the graph on the left side shows you the average annual temperatures for the state from 1920 to 2000 compared to the average annual temperature from 1961 to 1990, which is that line across the middle. So you can see that since 1990, temperatures have been steadily rising. So what this means on the ground is that floodplain water requirements will be even higher due to these higher temperatures. And that's why back in 2008, the Victorian Environmental Assessment Council pointed to reduced watering as the greatest threat to the values of our red gum floodplains, noting that this threat is expected to get even worse. We
had a clarification from the audience around the inflows, the change to flows, and is that figure flows before extraction or after extraction?
It's the flows, so the inflows graph is for Victorian tributaries, so it's the flows that are reaching the Murray.
Okay, thank you very much, Shah.
So yeah, fine, thank you. Where does this leave us? So what we're looking at into the future are lower inflows, fewer floods and higher temperatures. So it's really going to be a hotter, drier future. Dan at the start of this session described the really important values of the floodplains. So thinking back to them, what we can expect to see into the future is a substantial reduction in the extent and diversity of our floodplain ecosystems as the functioning floodplain contracts. We're likely to have red gums surviving only along the river and permanent creek lines, but because rainfall is just going to be too low for them to survive without floods. We can expect to see a shift in the kinds of wetlands that are left. We'll be losing lots of our semi-permanent systems and the species that depend on these. These are expected to shift to more ephemeral systems that can cope with only occasional flooding. And as a result, we can expect impacts on waterbird species, less habitat, less food available for frogs and turtles, and impacts on native fish as well. The river is going to be much less productive as the carbon and nutrient inputs from floods drop off. And of course, there's also those flow-on effects to terrestrial species that live on the floodplains, like woodland birds, snakes, goannas, bats. Of course, there will be some sort of a transition from flood-dependent systems to flood-tolerant or terrestrial systems, but we don't know how long this will take or what it will look like. So taking some action to protect what we can in the meantime is going to be very important. The really strong message coming from water industry experts is that farmers and other businesses need to adapt to a lower water future. So we really need to be thinking about how the environment can adapt as well. how we can get the best environmental outcomes with the water that's available, and how we can deliver social and cultural benefits alongside these. We know that we're going to have to make some pretty hard decisions about changing management objectives and how we do things. Maintaining floodplains with natural flooding is just not going to be possible. So we know that watering infrastructure like that's been built through the Living Murray program, it's going to be increasingly important to water our floodplains and maintain these as refuges during dry times. So the pictures on this slide show what we were dealing with in the Millennium Drought, when in 2007, Monash Uni found that 87% of red gums in the Mallee were declining or dead. The pictures in the middle show an example of a healthy tree canopy. So that's the picture on the right, and a highly degraded canopy on the left. Both of these were taken in Gunbower Forest in 2006. At the top left is a picture of Pile Bend on the Murray floodplain near Robinvale. This was taken in 2004. This area was later watered through the Red Gum Rescue Program, which was an emergency response that involved the CMAs, DSE at the time, and Parks Victoria to try and stop all of our red gums dying, particularly those very large old trees that were going to take hundreds of years to replace. At that point in time, all we could do was water creek lines and wetlands using temporary pumps. So it was pretty limited. And I think in 2007-8, we were able to water about 500 hectares of floodplain. At the top right, Walpola Island in 2007, this is a creek line that was watered through the Red Gum Rescue Program. So you can see some trees are starting to recover, but some are clearly dead. At the bottom left is Black Swamp in Gunbower Forest. It's looking pretty sad in 2008. And on the bottom right, we have the Eagle Tree in Gunbower Forest that some of you might know of. It's one of the largest and oldest red gums in the forest. It was a known nest tree for white-bellied seagulls and wedge-tailed eagles. In 2007, it looked like it was dying. Its canopy cover had declined to about 20%, and the local community rallied to save it. So a farmer donated 1 megalitre from his irrigation allocation, and the local SES created a bank around it with sandbags to hold the water. Gannawarra Shire trucked in water to the tree over a few months in early 2008. And happily, after the watering, the canopy cover increased to about 40%, giving it a much better chance of surviving. And I can let you know that it's still alive today, and it's also now within the watering footprint of the Living Murray Works at Gunbower. So we won't need to truck water to it anymore. And that's it for me today. I'll hand over to Deb.
Thanks, Shah, and hi also Deb Brown, Exec Director of Catchments, Waterways, Cities and Towns. And I'm really happy to be joining you virtually, but really wish it was in person, and I'm coming, unfortunately, from Melbourne for a couple more days, or Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country. So I think it's really important to stop and reflect for a moment here before I know you'll get a bit more detail on the project front from Paul. But what I wanted to do quickly is reflect on the journey we've had in relation to floodplain protection and management over the last 20 years as a snapshot, and then how that really looks as a more holistic package. There is a really important connection, as Shah and others have represented and discussed, about the connection between floodplains and the broader river health program. I describe them as pretty good mates that, for a range of reasons, including water extraction, climate change, and the changing landscape, have had a bit of a gap in their friendship created. And today's really demonstrating that to improve that relationship, a range of both water and works needs to be used to ensure that we can maintain or even achieve the outcomes for the floodplains that we are seeking. So it's really important, and the last 20 years has really shown that we can't do things the way we did in the past, and there are changing environmental conditions that Shah really demonstrated the severity of. But we also know communities are changing. As I said, we've got assets in these landscape that we need to understand and protect through flooding risks. We know that we are seeing water as a finite resource. And we know that we're operating in a changed economic environment. And we know that we're working with communities or within the community who have also had to adapt to changing water conditions. And the story of floodplain management has been our attempt to adapt to those situations. And so if we quickly look at the last 20 years, our commitment to floodplains started really back in 2003 with the Living Murray program and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan government's collective recognition that we really needed to do something to restore the health of the Murray River. But we had to focus our efforts to ensure that we didn't lose the opportunity we had. And so we selected 4 fully or partial sites within Victoria where we put our energy and emphasis. There was also a commitment to 500 gigalitres of water to be returned and the building of infrastructure to get to the water to the wetlands, to the floodplains. 500 gigalitres is not a lot of water when you're talking natural flooding, but when you're looking at ways that use infrastructure or works to get the water into the floodplains, it can make a significant difference. And we committed to looking at the environmental outcomes that we were trying to achieve for these sites to ensure that we had a commitment to the community about what we were doing with this water. In Victoria in 2014, another really important milestone happened through our Water Our Future with the creation of the Environmental Water Reserve and the legal recognition of water being set aside for the environment. And so that gave a legal protection for us to have water to call upon to deliver to these important floodplains. But we know that water and works alone weren't the only part of this journey. And in 2008, the Victorian Environmental Assessment released its report in River Red Gum Forest Health, which led to the important protection of some of these floodplains as national, state or regional parks, including essentially all of the river floodplains west of Mildura as part of the Murray Sunset Park, and giving us that level of protection that goes along with the other activities that Paul will speak to in a moment. In 2009, we saw the release of the Northern Region Sustainable Water Strategy on the back of 12 years of drought, and that really recognised the impacts of climate change and variability as one of the greatest threats to floodplains. And it really highlighted the need for water recovery, environmental works, complementary NRM activities to protect high-value rivers, wetlands and floodplains more holistically, and introduced a range of products such as carryover and system reserve that would help, I guess, in the story of floodplain management. In 2010, the establishment of the VIEW ensured that we had a statutory body who was managing environmental water on behalf of the environment, and through their annual works program, annual works planning ensures high priority waterways and floodplains receive the water that they need. They now hold over 650 gigalitres of water across the state. In 2012, we saw the Basin Plan and the commitment to the SDL process. And again, for us, the opportunity for us to invest in a range of activities to return water to the environment through modernisation of irrigation systems, and more importantly, to get environmental works funded to maximise, or actually, as I said before, achieve the outcomes we wanted for environmental water. This moves through to a range of other strategies and government commitments such as Water for Victoria that continues to recognise and build on the lessons learnt over the last 20 years about the importance of environmental water and the role environmental works plays in delivering that water to where it is needed most. We know works are not a standalone solution and need to be incorporated into a range of broader activities, which I'll talk to in a moment. Jump over to the next slide if I could, Jay. And so where we land today is this an adaptive arrangement to ensure that we protect our floodplains and manage our floodplains in the context of a broader river health. So, and all the presenters before me have spoken to this. We've stopped further extraction for water. We've recovered water for the environment. We've ensured we've established independent water holders to prioritise the delivery of water to critical sites. we ensure we have complementary arrangements such as the basin salinity management strategy to ensure our activities are not having unintended consequences. We've protected the floodplains through the creation of significant parks, and we have a range of planning controls as well into these systems. But we still need to use works to achieve and maximise the outcome. And just on the left of that slide outlines the range of projects where we've used works, such as the River Red Gum Rescue Shah spoke about, living Murray sites, such as Hatter and Gumbar and the Kerrang Lakes, where we've used works and measures to get environmental water into those critical floodplains. I'm going to pause there and hand over to Paul, who's going to speak in a bit more detail around these opportunities and outcomes.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. So Paul Bennett, I'm a director in DELWP, in statewide infrastructure, and I've got the job of implementing some of the next stages of the health of the River Murray. So I come to you today from Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and can't wait to get back up to the floodplains along the Murray. We've just heard Dan talk about such important values associated with our floodplains and our river systems. We've heard Nick and Shah talking about the impacts, the regulation, the somewhat bleak future of climate change, which means less water for everybody, whether it's towns, irrigation industry, or the environment. We've heard from Deb about what we've done so far, and we've been doing this. We've been on a journey for a very, very long time. It hasn't just been a whim in the short term. What I'd like to do is to talk to you in the next 10 or 15 minutes about the more that we can do. And so in that regard, I'll talk about efficient irrigation systems, and people have said to me, can't we just have more environmental water? Surely we've got some more there hiding somewhere. And also talk about some projects that connect the river back to the floodplain, building on the works that we've done over the past decade. Thanks, Kate. First one I want to talk about is efficient irrigation systems. And what do we mean by efficient irrigation systems or irrigation modernisation? It really means that we're trying to make our irrigation systems the best or most efficient in the world by channel lining, putting water through pipes, automation, and by creating water savings and investment into that water savings, we have significant benefits for irrigation because we're reducing labour costs. We're also producing water on demand, which increases yields and therefore jobs and growth in the region. But it also creates an opportunity for environmental water recovery. And over the past 15 odd years, we've been investing heavily in that water recovery and putting that water into storage to be called out by water holders to try and right some of the wrongs of overdevelopment. Recently, the Connections project and modernising the GMID, we spent over $2 billion between the state and the Commonwealth, which delivered over 279 GLs for the environment. And after 10 years of that project, we delivered that project on time and on budget in October 2020. We've also looked at other modernisation projects in Northern Victoria, such as Sunraysia. We've done Mitiamo. We did do some water savings projects around Lake McCowan. So people have said to me, surely there must be more. And the issue for us is we've looked absolutely everywhere, under every rock, under every corner of Northern Victoria, and there isn't a lot of water recovery projects associated with efficient irrigation systems. We have a project underway at the moment, the GMW Water Efficiency Project. That's going to create about 15.9 GL by June 2024. We've got some other projects on the go as well, but they're relatively small in the big scheme of things. And if you'd start talking about climate change and the needs for major flooding in the Murray, then these projects won't be able to deliver that particular amount of water. With all of our projects, we also apply socioeconomic criteria. And that's to ensure that when we do our projects, we're not actually impacting on regional communities. And that socioeconomic criteria was agreed by all basin ministers, including the Commonwealth Minister. So we're applying that socioeconomic criteria to all of our projects in our water recovery. Importantly, too, we're also looking at water recovery for traditional owners and starting to think hard about how we can do that through our projects. At the same time, we're looking for water for the environment. Thanks, Kate. So we have to use our available environmental water more smartly. We're not going to have gigalitres upon gigalitres of new water. And we know that water buybacks can actually impact on regional communities, and water buybacks are inconsistent with the criteria that ministers have actually signed off. So let me introduce you to the Victoria Murray Floodplain Restoration Project. I know a number of you online today would already be aware of the project. Project consists and builds on the extreme amount of work that went on the Living Murray process and the lessons and the outcomes from that project. And this project originated from people who are passionate about restoring the floodplain. Effectively, on the left-hand side there, you'll see a map. We have 9 sites, large-scale sites, watering some of the most important parts of the floodplain, complementing the work from the TLM program, ranging from Echuca right through to the South Australia border. And we picked those sites for a very good reason. Largely a national park estate, very, very sensitive environments, but very important environments to protect. We're looking at about 14,000 hectares, and if added to the TLM process program, you're looking at about 26,000 hectares of prime environmental cultural real estate that we're trying to protect here. They have high biodiversity values, as Dan talked about in his national parks, a really good mosaic of environmental values. They're not just wetlands themselves, but we're looking at black box and lignum as well. We've actually done work to show that we're feasible, that we can actually get the water to those sites even under a climate change future, which is really, really important. And we believe we can actually manage any negative or potential localised risks associated with those projects. Effectively, what we're doing in terms of these projects is using a set of man-made works. That's right, we're using pumps, regulators and containment banks to get water out of the river and onto the floodplain when natural flooding does not occur. So we're not trying to stop natural floods from reaching these particular places. What we're trying to do is to have works, the capability of ensuring these sites get the flows, the frequency, the duration, the magnitude that they need to survive into the longer term, whilst recognising, or if natural flooding doesn't do the job for us. Now, we know that under climate change and with the amount of development we've had, these sites are incredibly stressed and will only get further stressed. So these projects are going to be extremely important. Thanks, Kate.
Well, thank you very much, Paul.
What they also do is reconnect the river to the floodplain by removing works on the floodplain. So we actually have some levees within the forest, we have culverts, etc., which are actually stopping the flow of water. And on the right-hand side, you can see a regulator, a typical regulator that we would build into the forest, which actually allows water to go into the forest. We can hold it, we can close the regulator, and then we can actually release the water back to the Murray once the forest has had its appropriate drink or the birds have finished their breeding cycle. It's going to be critical part of the works that we're doing. Importantly, it doesn't actually stop natural floods going through the forest, which is an important part as well. These are obviously managed according to a watering strategy. That watering strategy is developed with ecologists, engaging the community, understanding what the social impacts are, the cultural impacts, or the benefits to the forest as well. And then we release the water, monitor the water, report on how we're going, and then come up with the next watering strategy for the next watering event. So it's an adaptive way in which we can water these floodplains. Thanks, Kate. The next project that I wanted to talk about, and some people may have heard the term constraints, and constraints is about making a flow pathway through the riparian corridor of the River Murray, and in some cases in New South Wales, some of their rivers, and also the Goulburn River. Effectively, what it means is moving constraints such as assets, which would normally get damaged in that riparian corridor, so that we can actually piggyback environmental water releases onto natural floods. The important part about constraints is that we're only targeting the minor flood level, whereas many of the wetlands and floodplains and the values that we're looking to protect in the longer term also require moderate and major flooding. And that's not something that a constraints program is set up to deliver, nor agreed to by governments. While we're only looking at the floodplain corridor, it sounds easy. Why don't we just flood some Crown land along the corridor? Unfortunately, that's not the case. Across the 6 constraints projects across South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria, we actually touch on about 3,500 private landholders. And we need to go through, look at assets of councils as well in that corridor, pumps, roads, culverts, levees, etc., to be able to negotiate, to be able to get a flow pathway, to be able to manage the risks from storages, releases from storages down that pathway. Our work to date has shown that there's little community confidence that we can actually manage risk. And for that reason, we've actually gone back and we're starting to do a feasibility study to go back, look at the technical information, engage more broadly, as the previous work was, the engagement was certainly limited and certainly not with traditional owners or Aboriginal nations along the river. So we're going back to redo that work, to look at the value proposition, and then to brief our minister about moving forward. And that project is feasibility study due to start soon and complete for next year. Thanks, Kate. So just to emphasise the difference between VMFRP and constraints, and I do get the question, why would you do VMFRP if you don't have, if you've got constraints coming? The little table there just again emphasises what we're targeting. So targeting riparian corridor below the minor flood level, that's what constraints is about, and for some reaches of the river system. VMFRP, large-scale site-specific watering across minor, moderate and major floods. Also, constraints doesn't actually help us between the long dries or between wets when we have long dries, because it actually depends on us having a piggybacking natural flood. If they don't occur, then we don't release water for constraints. So VMFRP becomes even more important. So just in summary, a couple of key messages, Kate, on the next slide to take away. We've done most of our efficient irrigation systems. We've certainly got a project underway. We're looking at a couple of opportunities, but there's going to be limited ability to find large-scale environmental water opportunities in Northern Victoria. The VMFRP, we're very much at a pre-construction phase, going through another 12 months of regulatory approvals, engagement, and talking about detailed designs. While construction is aimed to be completed by June 2024, it is subject to regulatory approvals and then funding by the Commonwealth. In terms of constraints, we've promised a feasibility study by the end of 2022, and we'll have a consultative committee made up of representatives across the community to oversight that, to provide a high level of transparency, particularly on the rigour and the technical work that we're doing there, and then also about how people will be treated in terms of compensation and risk, etc. So we want a lot of transparency on the constraints project. So I might just hand back there, James, back to you, and thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you as well to Deb before that and Shah before. Again, you told quite the story of the true impact and then the work that the Victorian government's been and in fact the MDBA as well too has been undertaking over the past 20 years and what's currently underway, Paul. So great summary there. Just a reminder to all of our attendees, the Q&A function is the one to hit if you have any questions or clarifications for our presenters. I've got 3 to work through just now, but it's not too late now. If you want to pop one in, please feel free to do so. So Shah, you're our first candidate, and this one relates to projects that might support black box communities. And of course, this isn't an exclusive game, so if any of our other presenters want to dive in and say anything, please feel free to. But Shah, the question relates back to something that Nick had in his model, and it was about showing that black box will not get enough water, especially in drought periods. So that fire chart, and it shows that the high floodplains are not getting all the water that it should under basin plan. So can you explain what the future of those black box communities are?
I can have a go, James. Some of the Live Murray projects actually do influence black box. So there are black box at the higher elevations around all of the Hattah Lakes. So when those large watering events are delivered, black box is watered, and black box is also watered around Lake Walla Walla and at Mulcra as well. Nick will probably be able to tell you the actual areas. I can't remember these anymore off the top of my head, although I once could. So there is some watering of black box that can happen now. And one part of what the VMFRP projects do is target areas, like particularly huge areas of lignum and black box, particularly on Lindsay and Walpolla Islands, that we currently can't water. So I think the outlook for black box, particularly because they often occur in those areas that are subject to floodplain salinisation. So outlook for black box is quite bleak without intervention.
Thank you very much. I'll pop on to the next question unless someone else wants to say anything. It looks like we're right to go. So the next question's for you, Deb, and this one relates to a cap on diversions from the Murray. And the question is, why hasn't Victoria called a halt to irrigation expansion over the last 20 years? And the writer has seen, a lot of dryland farms converting to almonds in the past. So the question's around on diversions from the Murray over the past 20 years.
Thanks, James. Look, I would start by saying we're talking about a system that is highly modified, and the caps on diversions have been in place, I guess, first in the 90s, and then through the basin plan, we saw the sustainable diversion limits. And we have an active water market that moves water around the system to those types of industries or agriculture that is highly productive. So I guess we acknowledge that we're working in a modified system. We're trying to prevent any more water coming out through those caps and through the works of the sustainable diversion limits in the basin plan and the range of water recovery projects that Paul mentioned. But it isn't in a landscape of the socioeconomics of the region and the fact that it is an area of productivity. We do have a water market that moves water to different types of industries, but we also have the opportunity to return water to the environment through pretty strong water products. And then it's the complementary nature of the works and measures that have been spoken about to try and maximise the use of that water to get environmental objectives and even to maximise where that's possible. So I think it's an acknowledgement of we've stopped taking water out of the system. We've done water recovery where it's been done in a socioeconomic neutral way, but we also have water moving around to a range of different users in the system.
Thank you.
I don't know, Paul, if you wanted to add anything from your perspective.
No, look, Deb, I think the main point that you raised is we cap diversions at 93, 94 levels of development. So been in place for a couple of decades. And so basically, if somebody wants to develop, they go to the water market. So there's no increase in water use.
And while you're talking there, Paul, I'll keep one over to you. So this question relates to socioeconomic, which you spoke about plenty of times through your presentation, but it's a feature for many people who are interested in why more water recovery, and it might also be related to floodplain constraints as well too, but why haven't governments called for more water recovery under Basin Plan or subsequent to Basin Plan?
Yeah, look, the government's agreed to, and I think some people might be referring to the upwater, the 450 GL. And governments have agreed, and there've been numerous reports into this, is about if you actually go into the water market, if you either you purchase water or you do on-farm savings where a farmer can give up some water, but then take the money and then go back into the water market, it actually impacts on water price. So it's okay. It sounds simple. Why doesn't somebody just go into the water market and buy the water for the environment? But the actual impact on water price and then the flow-on impacts to the regional communities have been recognised, not just by Victoria and the Victorian government, but right across all governments. And so the criteria really relate to impact on water prices, impact on regional businesses, jobs, etc. Any third-party impacts associated with that water recovery. So when we actually put up projects, we've got to actually demonstrate that before they go to the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth use those same criteria before they actually fund those projects. So it's not as simple as let's just jump into the water market. There are actually flow-on impacts, and the socio-economic criteria, which was debated for some time, is now actually sits there and drives a lot of our decision making.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Nick from MDBA. Nick, we've got a question that's asking about constraints, but not in the way you normally would expect. It's around what's being done to prevent more constraints from being built onto the floodplain.
So I'm going to answer that not from an MDBA perspective, but from a former CMA floodplain manager perspective. And the angle I'll take is that right across the state of Victoria, there are floodplain management strategies in place. And with those are a whole lot of planning schemes that regulate the construction of anything or the change of land use of any type on floodplains. So that is the Victorian government's mechanism for managing the creation, or actually really preventing the creation of new constraints on the floodplain. So that's managed through the planning scheme. What we're really dealing with is a legacy of history where those constraints were less actively managed.
Thank you very much. And we've got another question just popped in, and I need to nominate myself for this, but feel free if anyone else would like to do that. This one's around community consultation so far, and can we answer, how community can get more involved in a bottom-up approach? So yeah, most definitely. There's a lot of consultation occurring now that we're getting into a concept phase, and we've got something to share with community about what are the values in the landscape that might be impacted by these proposals, and how can we amend those. And towards the end of today, I'll finish with a couple of slides which talk about the next phase of consultation that's available. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to assess those values and potential impacts, and we've got access for community to meet with those specialists who are undertaking that work and ask questions through that process. And also there are dedicated engagement staff who you can get in contact with and have conversations with, and fact sheets and the like available. So we'll touch on just some contact points towards the end of the day, but the intent is most definitely that community voices, traditional owner voices are heard, and that decision makers who need to decide whether these projects go ahead or not in their final form will definitely clearly understand the voice of community and that they've been involved in the process of establishing them. So that's my answer, and I'll throw back to myself. I haven't got any extras at the moment through from our team that's moderating. Here we go, one coming through live. This is the benefit of live. So Paul, I've got one for you. This one relates to properties that own land that is, say, subject to inundation, so properties that are on floodplain, and asking whether they should expect to be flooded, and questioning how New South Wales is tracking in that same space. Is New South Wales working on constraints as well, to your belief, and how are they tracking in comparison to, say, Victoria?
Yeah, look, we've got a great working relationship with New South Wales. Obviously, when a river floods, it floods quite often both sides of the river, sometimes more one side than the other. So we're working conjunctively with them. When it comes to properties on the floodplain, and I did for a short stint of about 4 or 5 years leave restoration of rivers and go and work on flood risk management. Right? So a lot of people live on a floodplain. And a lot of people got flooded in 2010, 11 and 12, and that was natural flooding. There's a big difference between natural flooding and getting insurance for that natural flooding, or building and having regulations associated with those buildings, versus somebody causing damage. Right? So if a river operator causes flooding, they're actually liable under legislation. They can be taken off to court for compensation. So the river operators, both in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, have all the same sense of nervousness about if you're piggybacking a managed environmental flow release on top of a natural flood, you want to be pretty careful that it's going to stay within the boundaries that you actually want it to be. Therefore, you need to have the easements or agreements with property owners, assets have been moved, or who's accountable for fixing up the assets if and when they get damaged. And you need to be able to have the tools to be able to understand where the water goes. Now, that's I can remember in 2010, 11 and 12, when we were watching the floods go out across the landscape, nobody actually knew where the water was going. That became problematic. So I could see if we don't actually get the constraints program right and take community on that journey with us, work out that value proposition, work out the liabilities, understand from a legal perspective, we could just end up in court for a very, very long time. In actual fact, I doubt whether ministers would actually agree, because the compensation packages would come back to the public purse.
And so there's a body of work underway at the moment, isn't there, for constraints? So what's Vic doing at the moment in the constraint space to push that work along?
Yep. So our feasibility study is looking at that information gap around the policies about compensation, the mapping, the river management tools, etc. The value proposition in terms of, if you're able to water the floodplain, but only in that riparian corridor, what are the true benefits that we're actually getting out of this? And we'll come back after that 12 months and then work out where to from there. So Victoria is not walking away from looking at constraints, but what we are doing is to say, let's take a bit of a deep breath here, because the community don't have a lot of confidence in our ability to manage risks. And at the end of the day, they're going to be feeling the brunt of a river operator who's released water when they shouldn't. So it's a real issue for us, and it's a large landscape change project. And we just don't want to get ahead of the community. We want to take community on the journey with us.
Yeah, no, seems simple in a conceptual space, but when you lift the covers, there's a lot to unpack in that space. So thanks for that, Paul. Coming back. Oh, sorry,
yeah,
Nick.
Just to put that in perspective and give a real life example of that, the sort of liability of river operators. I just went and had a look at what the current state of play is with the lawsuit surrounding the Wivenhoe Dam releases in Brisbane in 2011. So the legal proceedings are still going there 10 years after the fact. So this is the level of litigation that dam operators face if people are unhappy with the inundation that results from operations.
Great context, Nick. Thank you. And another question, Paul, towards yourself, and it was around the socioeconomic criteria again. Is there somewhere where people can find out more about that, or are the criteria at a state or federal level published anywhere that you're aware of?
Oh, absolutely. So it's published on the DELP website. What I can do is perhaps I'm not sure how we communicate with people post webinar, James, but it's certainly on the department's website. If you Google socioeconomic assessment for water efficiency projects, it should come up pretty readily, and it'll be on the Commonwealth website as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. Our question field has dried up. So I think you've all done a pretty good job there of getting across what's come through. So there being any further questions, we might put the slide pack back up, and I'll give people a few messages about next steps and where they can get involved. Thank you so much to all of our panellists. Did any of the panellists have anything else they'd like to say before we call a close to the roundtable conversation? Okay. Alrighty, next step. So we'll jump on to the next slide if you like. There we go. So there's a timeline for the project showing all the steps through till 2024, and there are plenty of them. I'd like to talk about a few key dates in particular, where there's some opportunities coming up in the next couple of months for people to talk to our project engagement team and keep up to date with those technical studies. And I think that might be on the next slide, Keely. But as I said earlier in the presentation, please feel free to contact our engagement officer, Jodie Reynolds, and get on the list for our quarterly newsletter, and all of the opportunities sit in there about providing community opportunities to have their say across all of the 9 sites. Now, look, on behalf of all of the agencies and presenters today, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone for participating. We have a common interest in repairing and caring for our floodplains, and that's evident with the great contributions of people who've spent a lot of their career working to this end, but also to the great number of community representatives who've showed up today who are showing interest. And we look forward to continuing this partnership on with you in both digital and non-digital forms over the coming years. So thanks again for your contributions, and we look forward to seeing you next time.